There is a new vulnerability hitting the streets and being actively exploited in the wild, all pertinent to this software called CrushFTP. It is a software solution written in Java to offer file transfer services. Now let me say I'm recording this video on April 23rd, and this thing hit the light of day on April 19th, when a lot of folks started to chat about it, and one of the most, I think, earliest ones from CrowdStrike over on their subreddit, noting CrushFTP advised of a virtual file system escape present in their FTP software that could allow any arbitrary user to download system files on that host and on the endpoint. This affects versions of the software CrushFTP below 11.1, and it is just that, almost in a sense local file inclusion, but we'll pull that thread a little bit further to see how it could develop. In those early days, when there wasn't a ton of information out and about, there was no CVE, or Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures, identifier assigned to that vulnerability. There was a whole lot of chatter across the internet, though, with a whole lot of folks noting, look, this is already being exploited in the wild and compromising hosts that are out on the public internet. I really like this post on r/cybersecurity over on Reddit. Someone had commented and responded, yeah, we moved from CrushFTP to Move It. Whoops, that's tough. Obviously, this whole thing hit the news. This is an article from Bleeping Computer with the headline, hey, CrushFTP warns users to patch this exploited 0-day immediately. So high severity, high impact, big criticality. This is something we should take seriously. And at that point, I think around April 22nd, now it is tagged as CVE 2024-4040. Let me give credit where credit is due. This was found and disclosed by Simon Garelu. I'm sorry, I'm not sure about your last name, Simon, of Airbus Cert, and that's pretty awesome. Really cool to see those guys up in action here. Now fixed in CrushFTP versions 10.7.1 and 11.1.0. So anything prior is vulnerable. I've seen a lot of different numbers on how many of these are publicly exposed, whether it's almost 3,000. I think I've seen some folks say just about 5,000, almost 6,000. And if you happen to be thinking, well, I've heard of that CrushFTP thing before, if you weren't already familiar, you might be right. Look, you probably caught wind of the news cycle way back in November, just the very end of last year. CrushFTP was again vulnerable to a critical remote code execution vulnerability, CVE 2023-43177. So yesterday, if you're following along with this timeline, again, I'm recording on April 23rd, but I had tweeted just previously a little bit of a tease on April 22nd that, look, I've seen and I've recreated the CrushFTP proof of concept that didn't previously have the CVE identified, but had to edit this tweet to say now it is 4040, and the attack chain is pretty dumb. It's pretty simple, it's small stuff, but it's something that we could showcase and dig into. So I'd like to do that in this video, but let me add the little note here. I am kind of noting, oh, if you look for those 404 HTTP response codes, like a page is not found, maybe that could be an indicator. And I had that breadcrumb, but let me acknowledge, hey, that's actually, now that I've learned a little bit more, not all that really is needed. It doesn't strictly have to be a 404 to trigger, oh, getting a component of the attack chain. You could just as easily get what you might need as the next puzzle piece with the 200 status code. We'll chat about it in a sec. Before we start cutting up some code, I think there is another interesting thing that we can do when there is word of a new emerging vulnerability that is actively being exploited and something that we could track across the cybersecurity horizon. So I thought, well, let's use Flare to see if there are any cyber criminals, threat actors, adversaries that are already chatting about this, that are talking about it, and in case they might say, oh, that one looks neat, or hey, I want to use this on target XYZ. It's cheesy, but I think it's worth a shot. Now, if you aren't familiar, we could use Flare to track down our own identifiers, hey, maybe specific domain names or usernames, websites, email addresses, and accounts that we care about for ourselves personally, or our company, our business and organization, other employees that we're making sure are doing the right thing online, and that can help us assess our own threat exposure and attack surface management. Or we could use this for some research, and we could go see what folks are chatting about regarding CrushFTP across some of the more spooky, scary parts of the internet. I can search for this and I can drill down into the different categories that might have an offering here. But look, if I wanted to take a look at stuff on the ClearNet, up on the open internet, maybe some lookalike domains or cleared leaked credentials, or just the open web, whether it's pastebin sites, maybe web accounts, Git repositories and source code, or cloud-hosted activity stuff on Google, buckets, Amazon S3, yada, yada, yada. I don't need to worry about that, but I am curious about some of those illicit networks, like like malware marketplaces or cybercrime, hackers for hire, stuff like that. Whether it's forum posts, Telegram, chat conversations, I'm curious if anyone is discussing that CrushFTP. Now again, I want to drill that down probably just about the last week or so, maybe the last 2 days, but I'm curious, hey, can we see any new hits? About 43 coming through. I'm curious if there's anything other than just the news. Got some messaging from an account on Telegram. They've got, oh, the cutesy little image, and Flare's kind of cool. They can pull a lot of the images from different Telegram channels that might be helpful and worthwhile for investigations or work that you do. And it looks like this is just sort of the boilerplate, hey, maybe information and awareness getting out to everyone in that crew. Nothing special here. Oh, they drill down into some census data. They're saying like 9,600 publicly exposed CrushFTP hosts. That's pretty wild. And HelpNet security and some more news articles out this. And of course, you got the usual call to action and social media crap. What else is there? Some more notifications, again, on Telegram, hackers feed. We could drill down into the content section and see what other folks might be discussing here. But at least in a lot of Telegram channels like this, they're probably just spewing out more notifications and alerts. This one from the user Hacker Tricks, though, is a little bit interesting because that might share some new resources for us, links or repositories, tools that we weren't familiar with before. If I take a look at the content, looks like, oh, I'll specifically zoom in on that message. Yeah, they've got a link for Airbus cert and their own scanner, little proof of concept to try to find and detect vulnerable instances. I plan to chat about that a little bit later when we dig into the vulnerability and the exploit and the code that we write, but let's table that for now. Some more hits of the same stuff. Dark leak monitor on Telegram. Hey, at least there's some Cyrillic characters or Russian language there. Maybe that'll have at least something remotely interesting. Well, okay, no, these are just more messaging. And honestly, the things would have a low severity. You can see the big yellow there. Maybe the medium ones I'm more interested in, so I can filter that out in the results. Let me just close. Okay, now we'll bring down to just about 3 events. Great. Saves us from scrolling through all those, but even these, which might very well just be, again, more discussions and showcases of it, at least they give us the Onion link, so we could go take a look at that across Tor, the Onion router, and dark web if we'd like. But I'll be the first to say, look, I can't read that language, so I could use either the AI assist to see if it could ask ChatGPT, do whatever artificial intelligence magic to get a little bit more context on the conversation, or we can go copy and paste that into a translator. In fact, using some AI to do the translation might really help. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with this, but if you aren't, hey, this is one of those more dedicated, fine-tuned LLM shenanigan things with ChatGPT to do some translating, but actually retain a lot of the context, slang, and kind of the vernacular that's used in that language or dialect, whatever it might be. So I could say, hey, translate this from Russian to English, and I'll paste all this in here. Let's see if it can spit it out and give me a little bit more context clues. Tracking it down, okay. CrushFTP file transfers are strongly recommended to be updated to the latest version after a vulnerability was discovered. Yeah. Okay, everything we already know, nothing all that new. Here, yeah, they have a couple cool clarifications or a little bit more explanation as to what some of these terms might mean in the context. So, nice, looking good. Well, that's one trick. Again, Flare can do that just as well for you. If you hop on over to the AI assist, gives you the translation and even a little bit more context in the circle of cybercrime and communication platforms there. There's another hit and hey, a result on a forum called Gurky, and maybe this account Newsmaker chatting about it. I don't see any conversation or responses, comments on that thread though, so there's not a whole lot we could drill down into. I'm going to assume that's a lot more messaging, notifications, just getting folks aware. Hey, whatever the case may be, I hope you think that's an interesting use case for Flare, trying to see what threat actors are doing and chatting about when a new vulnerability is popping off and there's a lot of commotion and chatter about it. With that said, big thanks to Flare for sponsoring this video. You can check him out with the link below in the video description. Okay, sorry, I know that's enough talk and rambling background context. Now let's get to the demo. So I am inside of my Windows 11 virtual machine, and remember, this CrushFTP application could run on Windows or on Linux or on Mac. It is a Java-based application, so it could run just about anywhere. If you were to go onto their website and go try and download a version that you could go play with and test, there is a download now button that'll take you to that download page in the navigation, but it'll tell you all about, look, this is going to be version 11 and the latest rendition that has the patch, because obviously, look, the vulnerability, they want to be locking all the doors, boarding up the windows here, so you would download the latest version 11 with the links given. If you scroll all the way down, you can track down an old CrushFTP version 10 download, but that is still patched. Even if you were to take the link here, if I copy that link, and you might be able to see it down below in the navigation, if I were to change this number from like, oh, early 10 10 to early 9 to try and get an even older version, it would return a file. We could download it and that would work for us, but even that version 9 that's hosted on the webpage is patched. Now, after I got to chat with some folks, hey, bounce some ideas around, think on this and do a little bit more research, we had found, look, this CrushFTP 10.5.0 B2 vulnerable build that was available out on GitHub from the past CVE 2023-43177 by the Hammond, one of the individuals here on GitHub, and we could chat about that soon, but they had been generous enough to share, hey, here's a copy of the old school original CrushFTP 10.zip, but it included another copy with a different edition that you could just sort of patch onto it, overwriting the files there and still maintain the vulnerabilities. Now, I've gotten these both downloaded on my Windows 11 virtual machine, and we could, hey, drill down, take a look, but honestly, the only interesting file here in my mind is this jar file. It is a Java application after all, and if we go take a look at that other, hey, sort of in-place hotfix we could do for the vulnerability we could introduce, it is just something we'd clobber that jar file. And with it being Java, we could decompile that down. Now, normally I like to use tools like JDGUI or JADX, some of the others. I found one that I think is pretty awesome here, Procyon, I don't know how to say that, but it does include a Java decompiler. I've heard great recommendations from some folks, so hey, we could go download, if you weren't familiar, this Procyon decompiler as a release and go get it running. I am going to end up cruising this through just on Linux. I'm over here inside of an Ubuntu virtual machine right now, but I've got that downloaded in stage for us, so we'll play with it. Let me invoke Java tac-jar on that Procyon decompiler, and it gives me all of the output on how we might use this thing, and there are a couple things that are worthwhile here. Ultimately, just the output directory, because otherwise it would just spit everything out to the standard output, just display it all on the screen. It's got some nice syntax highlighting though, so I gotta give it that. But if I were to, hey, just drop in, paste those files for our FTP instance, we'll include the zip files that we'll extract and get the jar file to decompile and do some patch diffing, really, to see what's different between the vulnerable version and something that might not be. With that in mind, make sure you are benchmarking and sort of diffing, taking a look between what would be a genuinely patched rendition, like the latest thing you download from their website, and the rendition that we know is vulnerable. So make sure you pull from their website v10 if that's what you're doing. I will go ahead and showcase the vulnerable one if I wanted to actually go extract, unzip that v10 5.0. That includes the plugins directory and the jar file that I'd like to decompile. So let me use that Java tac-jar. Procyon decompiler will supply the output for our vulnerable, and then we'll be sure to include the current CrushFTP.jar file in our current directory. That should, once it's done, decompile everything we need and slap it into a new vulnerable directory that we can go analyze. You could follow this exact same process for the patch rendition and then do a diff with some GUI tools like Meld or whatever you might like and prefer. Ultimately, just put the files side by side, see what differs. We've showcased that in previous videos, so I won't drill down into the weeds right now, but that's how patch diffing comes to life. And while we're doing that, honestly, we still haven't seen this application in action yet, so let's go do what we were planning to do by taking all of the files from that hotfix version that we saw on GitHub, clobbering it in the CrushFTP folder. Let me go ahead and paste these. Yep, we can replace them as needed. Now, if I double click on CrushFTP.jar, having Java installed, we'll see this version of CrushFTP made available to us with a couple options. We can create a new admin user, install this as a service, start a temporary server, remove, start, stop, whatever. If I create an admin user, just for the sake of having one, we'll use CrushAdmin as the default username, and let me just enter CrushAdmin by default as the password here. That'll create the user. If you wanted to install this as a service, you do need to have a license, in which case it being paid for, but we can start up a temporary server just as well. Let me click on that, and it spins it up on port 8080 locally and on those interfaces. So let's go take a look. Can I go see CrushFTP spun up on this instance? Go to localhost 8080, and there we are, CrushFTP. That's all it takes. It redirects me to web interface and login.html. Nothing special there, really just, okay, where it puts you for the application. But that is an endpoint that we'll talk about. Back over on the Linux side, if we wanted to finish up our our patch diffing process or just take a look at the decompiled code, we could open up this vulnerable instance, take a look at all of the new Java that we might be able to read in all the different locations here. Now I'm going to streamline us a little bit because I've done that and tried to see, okay, what's actually different between these two. And the most interesting stuff that aligns well with the screenshot that I got a little sneak peek at actually brings us down into one of the server session.java files. Actually, forgive me, the juicy one is server status.java. So I've gotten that opened up here and there's a lot to it, right? This is a hefty file, but again, I'll zoom in on and kind of speed rust to the more interesting tidbits, because if we were to get a session here, and I'll show you how we can do that. Let's actually start to write the script and kind of go back and forth between the code and what we'll do as our proof of concept. Let me hop back over to the Windows VM where I have this installed and running, at least in that temporary instance, and we can interact with it locally without a problem. So let me start a new Python script. We'll just slap it into, I don't know, crushit.py. That's fun. And if I import the requests module to make a couple of these URL HTTP communications back and forth, can I get to localhost 8080 on that web interface endpoint? Let me do a request.get of that URL. We can store that as a variable and then print out the text response. If I hit Control B to run this, that returns a selected resource not found just because I didn't supply like, oh, a login.html or whatever. Now that'll print out all the HTML response of that usual page. But the interesting thing is, like if I were to take a look at, I don't know, the R status code alongside the headers, if we want to take a look at those, r.headers, anything that might be interesting, there's not a whole lot there, except it is only being done right now with a .get request. There's something interesting that happens if you do a post request to literally any endpoint. I'll hit Control B to run this one more time, but now you can see that it sets a cookie with a current auth and even a crush auth set to a value. So we have a null session, so to speak, or an anonymous user kind of still being able to interact with things even without username or password or credentials. So unauthenticated control to a couple different things. Not everything, and bear in mind, look, this could just go to any endpoint, even ones that do not exist. Run this one more time, new cookie, new auth token, anything that might be necessary, and we've got that session. Just a post request. Now I'm hopping back into Linux just to see some of the source code because there's something we could drill down into next. When we make these post requests, when we have this null anonymous session given to us, we could still ultimately funnel down to like the REST API or some control set up for this application. Maybe we could run and access a couple different endpoints or commands with parameters we pass to do different things via the API. Now, I'll admit, let me lay my cards on the table, when I got to see the screenshot that the anonymous, hey, individual was willing to share, they were doing something interesting with a couple of these endpoints with some syntax that they used that seemed to include a particular file. And that was a little bit of the magic sauce there. When it was supplied, when data was provided with this include syntax, it might literally do include file command. And that is how you could at least read a file in what looked like arbitrary file inclusion, but maybe even a little bit more, because there is so much potential with what you could do inside of this function. I'll show you it in a little bit, but take a look. There's a whole lot of like handling and functionality for doing different things with given variables or, I don't know, hostname kind of sort of configuration, server properties that you could access and reach, like user time remaining, their user session ID, user current directory, username, etc., etc. Hopping back over to Windows to play with our little attack script, say we actually would retrieve our current auth and crush auth cookies from this response. You could use a session, but I think it's nice to handle this kind of explicitly if we're building out like a proof of concept, in case we do any weird voodoo magic later. So let's go ahead and extract the r.cookies here. And we actually don't need to even index anything. We can just store that as sort of a variable outside of the scope or namespace of just that object. Because we'll do some other things, make other requests, and create a different new R variable. Because I know this is weird, but if I were to literally do another post method to this exact same URL, but this time supply some data, and we'll fill that out as another little dictionary that we could supply, we could do a couple different things like supply different commands that we might want the API to do. One of those is the exists function. Now, I'm sorry, I know I'm abstracting a lot here, but if I get back into the decompiled code, what if I were to search for that function call, maybe just matched as a string here, exists, and we could drill down and see, hey, some of the use cases as to where that is included in the source code. Maybe some FTP communication, maybe some S3 work, SFTP. There's one that's a little bit more interesting in the server session.ajax, where it's testing if a command equals ignore case of exists. And it does some interesting things. Let's actually go take a look. And again, let me say, I was only able to kind of track that down from seeing the logs and the artifacts left over on that compromise instance. I don't know what's going on with the syntax highlighting here, but if a command were to be provided where we exist looking to check if a file exists, then it will respond with some XML data, kind of pulling out things based off of the paths variable, it looks like, and presumably checking if a file that's provided exists on the file system, returning it out with some XML responses. We could play with this. Let's try it out. Back to our little sandbox script on the Windows side, we knew that the other parameter it would have been looking for is like a path, and granted, we probably want to be looking for, I don't know, anything. We could see if that even exists as a file called just like anything.txt, right? And there is some other oddity. This actually takes another parameter of like the cookie authentication sort of thing. It should be from the cookies that we've just received, the current auth value. That's actually just the last 4 characters of the crush auth value. So we'll stage all that. Let's go ahead and set that as the response variable or object to capture it. And can I see what the r.text response and output should be from just this simple little post request? We will need to be sure to include our cookies that we've been tracking those, since those should be headers alongside our requests. Now, if I hit Control B to run this, take a look. We've got some XML response here that says the command result anything.txt, what we were querying and looking for with the parameter, is false. That file does not exist. Now, this should be reading from the sort of local directory. If I do things like a relative path, I could do anything that might be local to that directory where CrushFTP is currently running. That's on my desktops here in CrushFTP 10. So we could pull down the whole binary or the installation instructions, preferences, maybe session objects, RSA keys, etc. But we'll just be checking if they exist right now. But remember, we saw some functionality, and I realize I'm not drilling down through the entire call chain, so bear with me here, but there was some magic where, look, if it had the include functionality included as the string in the parameters here, then it might literally just include a file. If I go track down this function here, this ends up checking for the include presence, creating a new random access file, getting some of the content out of it, and displaying it in the response. So let's just do an experiment here, like include our anything.txt. In fact, maybe we should make sure to close that, since that's how it was going to end up replacing it in the string here. Now, obviously, that anything.txt file doesn't exist, but we could check to see, could we include a file that does exist? Let's try to use some of those that we saw just a moment ago, kind of browsing through the file explorer here. We saw this SSH host RSA key, and if I run this, if I hit Control B with these include tags to potentially include a file, look at that. There is the raw contents and output of this SSH private key present on the box. This could be done remotely. It doesn't have to be local from this testbed example that we've done here. And I don't know, could I try to do this on like C, Windows, System 32? Let me add an R. Make this a raw string. Drivers, etc. Hosts. Can I pull the hosts file? Control B. Yeah. So that is totally outside of a virtual file system, like anything in an FTP sort of service might create. Like, hey, you have this enclave of files that you're willing to serve, but no, we should have this read capability, thanks to this potential vulnerability, across the endpoint anywhere on the file system. And just as I mentioned, you could try to provide any of those sort of variables that you might like, that we saw even in some of the code earlier, or we could track down in the documentation. Like host name with 2 parentheses wrapped, or percent signs around it, should actually return literally the IP address. There's even some other syntax for server variables, like a user underscore name when we're wrapping this in the curly braces. If I run this, that should return the value anonymous where that's presented, because that's the anonymous user session that we're in right now. We could check out the user ID, that's 72 in my case. If I keep running this, that should give me new ones, right? Because it's a new anonymous session each time. And a lot of these server variables are are represented and included in their documentation. You can track it down online. Take a look at some of the other things you might be able to pull and access. And this is interesting to me, right? Because that's not strictly local file inclusion, but almost in a sense like server-side template injection, sort of kind of, because you could read different variables or configuration settings. Now, at the very start of all this, what I just showed you was the extent of what we knew of the vulnerability. It's presumably, once it got a CVE, look, okay, breaking past the VFS or virtual file system to read any other local file on the endpoint. But we have to wonder, could this be pushed further? Could you use it for remote code execution? Could you leverage that to run commands and ultimately fully compromise the host if that service is installed and running as system? I gotta say, I haven't tracked down a way to do that, leverage this thing all the way to full RCE, but let me say now that it is totally possible. We'll chat about that in just a second, but at least the idea, kind of like what I was thinking, maybe what sounds possible or plausible, is that, look, CrushFTP will host and store things in a sessions.obj file. And that's sort of like an active cache for actively logged in users. Because we could read files, maybe we could pull that file down, go ahead and carve out and pull out some of the session cookies, and then hope and pray that, oh, the admin user logged in, and we could steal their session cookie, bypass authentication to become the admin, and then create a new task or job and gain natural remote code execution just through the functionality of the app and the admin capability. Let me show you that. Like if I were to just simply include that sessions.obj file relative in the current directory, try to pull that down, you'll see that it's a boatload of nonsense. It's a blob, it's a binary data, like marshaled, whatever, compressed to, look, ultimately be able to store, retrieve, recall that data as needed. But look at all of these sort of structures, all of these different components that look like auth tokens, because they actually are. They were for these logged in sessions. Now, because I've ran this script over and over and over again, we've got a lot of anonymous sessions here. But again, to a certain amount, you'd have to hope the admin session happens to be logged in at the time of your exploit, or just keep looping and wait and try to steal this until you could steal that session and then get code execution. Truth be told, actually, that method is basically what was done in the old previous CVE 2023 43177 bug with CrushFTP. When they leveraged this to remote code execution, they did exactly that, tracking down, trying to keep an eye on that sessions.obj file, and then hoping to see, can we get an admin session user logged in at that time? Let me go drill down, find it for us. Here it is. Yeah. Okay, let me zoom in. In the primary install folder, a serialized Java object called sessions.obj contains cached information about current logins, including all active and live user session tokens. So we could totally track that down to steal the admin capability. If you take a look at the script, the attack script and proof of concept exploit put together for that old vulnerability, that is exactly what they do. They actually have, hey, some functionality trying to steal the session pot file with sessions.obj, and then they'll just try each and every one of those API or auth tokens to see, look, do we have admin access, and then try to run code execution. If you scroll down well enough into the POC, you can see how they actually pull off that RCE, but bear in mind that was for the old CVE, not the one that we're chatting about right now, 2024 4040. If you take a look back at the scanner code that we saw from Flare, this other GitHub repository, even from Airbus Cert themselves, hey, the folks that actually found and disclosed, reported this vulnerability in the first place, they put out the scan host Python script that basically gives and showcases this proof of concept for exploiting the current vulnerability. So I didn't feel too bad and like, oh, showcase and spilling the beans on that file inclusion trick. I don't think I could demo the RCE component yet, but I know someone who can, and it might already be out and about. And because I've got to give a seriously big kudos to Rapid7, who's been doing an awesome job keeping track of this, chasing this CrushFTP vulnerability, digging into the code, trying to understand and analyze how far deep does this rabbit hole really go. And look, this is a tweet from Caitlin Condon, I believe their vulnerability research director over at Rapid7. She's saying, look, there's thousands of these exposed to the internet, all the instances that are publicly available, and there is exploit code, or at least the scanner that showcases how this is done, and payloads that already discuss the exploit path and the artifact seen from actual in the wild compromises. The cat is already out of the bag. I do really like her sprinkling in another tidbit here. Look, if we take this in comparison, contrasting with like move it transfer exploitation, when that was a hot topic, that were about maybe 2,500 instances, and now we've got a little bit more chatting about CrushFTP. But look, one of the researchers that was really digging into this is Chair Nectar, who analyzed this CVE, found that it's not only exploitable for the arbitrary file read, as we just demoed, but they can do the authentication bypass and full remote code execution. Big shout out, kudos, celebration for Ryan Emmons and his great work. I don't know if you were tracking, but that is the very same Ryan Emmons who put together this GitHub repo with the vulnerable instance of CrushFTP for folks to download and work with, and the proof of concept script, and one of the same fellas who would disclose and put together the original reporting for that first CVE 2023. I think that's pretty cool, honestly, to see him, hey, just about everywhere, closing the circle in this. And this is the article right up in messaging that is available from Rapid7 so far. Again, reminder, I'm recording on April 23rd, and I believe by the time this video releases, it'll be April 25th. So between then and now, while I'm recording and this releases, I believe there will be some new information, because Rapid7 tells me, I've been chatting with some of the folks over there, that they will release their full breakdown, their deep dive analysis, and spill the beans on everything CrushFTP probably tomorrow. So yesterday, by the time this releases. Just to reiterate and emphasize, there is more to this vulnerability and that it can be fully unauthenticated, just like we did without credentials, but not just taking the local file inclusion, so to speak, but even leveraging it for an authentication bypass to the admin account and then full remote code execution. So, point and shoot hacking, high impact, high criticality, absolutely patch now if you are in the CrushFTP world. With all that said, my goodness, I'm sorry there was a whole lot to ramble on in this because I wanted to give all the background context and I wanted to show a little bit of the fireworks, at least just slapping together some stupid Python script to showcase that small, simple attack chain. And look, drilling down in some of the artifacts that you can find from, hey, compromised instances, doing patch diffing, trying to drill down into even just open source stuff that's out on the internet, or checking in what cybercrime threat actors and adversaries are talking about with the vulnerabilities. Maybe they'll share some links, maybe they'll talk about their own plans or operations. I don't know, you never know, but it's worth taking a look. So, hey, again, please do give some love to our sponsor, Flare. Link in the video description if you'd like to drill down into that just as well for your own exposed attack surface and threat management. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. Like, comment, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Love you. Take care.